I didn't see it coming. Hamilton's unbelievable comeback left everyone speechless. Witness the moment that changed everything. Watch now. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. Lewis Hamilton emerged from the pit exit beneath the overcast skies of Spa-Francorchamps with a demeanor not of desperation, but of quiet rebellion. There was no championship in play. No hero's arc set up by the media. No narrative waiting to crown his comeback. There was only silence. Disbelief. Fatigue. His name hadn't dominated headlines all weekend. Pundits weren't debating his race pace. Commentators weren't forecasting miracles. He was last on the grid, not metaphorically, not due to penalties or freak weather, but because the car was a mess and the team had once again misread everything he tried to tell them. His Saturday had been a disaster. The kind that doesn't need exaggeration. The SF25 had felt unstable from the moment he rolled out of the garage. Turn-in was hesitant. Traction was inconsistent. The rear end twitched violently under braking. And his telemetry was a scream in data. Everything pointed to a fundamental misalignment between man and machine. He spoke up. He articulated clearly. He offered experience and input refined through 2 decades of elite competition. And yet, his concerns were met with blank stares, passive nods, and politely dismissive "we'll review that" replies. He was alone. Ferrari had once promised him redemption. A second dynasty. The rebirth of a legend in red. But instead, they had given him confusion disguised as strategy and loyalty weaponized as silence. The car wasn't just off pace. It was untrustworthy. It turned when it shouldn't. It snapped when he needed precision. No matter what he requested, whether it was brake bias shifts, anti-roll bar changes, or differential mapping tweaks, the answer came too late or not at all. And so, as the lights went out and 19 drivers surged forward with intent and ambition, Hamilton activated something different, a fury honed by betrayal. He didn't launch recklessly. He didn't panic. He played the first lap like a hunter observing prey. He avoided contact in the chaos, navigated through blind spots, braked late but clean, and began the unthinkable. He started overtaking. Not with raw horsepower. Not with a DRS rocket ship. But with sheer instinct, mechanical sympathy, and timing sharpened by thousands of laps in cars far better than this one. He started pulling apart the grid, one victim at a time. Through the bus stop chicane, he dove without hesitation. Into turn 5, he swept around the outside with millimetric confidence. In Sector 2, the rhythm section of Spa, he painted lines that engineers hadn't even simulated. What he was doing wasn't just extraordinary. It was deliberate defiance. Every pass he made was a reminder, this is what I'm capable of, even when you give me nothing. The Ferrari pit wall, so often composed and clinical, began to murmur. They hadn't seen this coming. Their strategy sheets had no recovery model from P20 to P7. Their projections had placed him out of points unless there was a safety car miracle. But Hamilton wasn't waiting for miracles. He was engineering his own resurrection. He wasn't speaking much on the radio. No dramatic messages. No complaints. Just cold, functional communication. Tire temps. Brake behavior. Fuel target. That's all. And yet, in that silence, there was power. The kind of power that doesn't need volume because the driving says it all. Midway through the race, he made a strategic call to pit early, a choice that raised eyebrows even among rival teams. The mediums weren't expected to survive the full distance he aimed for. But he didn't blink. He didn't ask permission. He demanded the change, knowing that he could extract performance where others couldn't. He trusted himself more than the numbers. He was right. The outlap was ballistic. He jumped 2 cars in one sector. As others managed temperatures and tread life, Hamilton carved through traffic like a scalpel. His brake traces were aggressive but controlled. His throttle application was impossibly smooth, conserving energy without ever conceding speed. Every lap after the stop was another chapter in a masterclass few could replicate, let alone understand. His Ferrari was not fast in a straight line. It didn't have the best downforce. The balance was still inconsistent. But Hamilton made it transcend its design. The way he rotated the car through Les Combes. The way he held momentum through Pujon. The way he launched out of La Source, it defied logic. This wasn't a race car. It was a burden. but he carried it like a weapon. As the final stint approached, he was running inside the points. The paddock had turned its eyes away from the leaders and toward the scarlet number 44, a car that wasn't meant to be there, now threatening drivers who had started 10 positions ahead. Commentators who had barely mentioned him earlier in the race were now scrambling for words. Team radios across the grid began reporting Hamilton's approach with a mixture of disbelief and panic. Then came lap 39. Side by side into Blanchiment with a faster car, an impossible place to make a move. He didn't back down. He forced the issue. Trusted the grip. Trusted himself. Executed a move that had millions of viewers standing on their feet, and stunned the Ferrari garage into stunned silence. He crossed the line in P7. On paper, a decent recovery. In context, one of the most staggering displays of racecraft Spa has seen in years. But it wasn't the number that mattered. It was the symbolism. This wasn't just a recovery drive. It wasn't a salvage mission. It was a declaration. An unmissable, undeniable signal to Ferrari. A warning shot to the rest of the paddock. A reminder that when Lewis Hamilton is ignored, underestimated, and provoked, he doesn't just respond. He reinvents the narrative. No post-race theatrics. No helmet throw. No fiery outburst. He walked back to the garage slowly, methodically. His body calm, but his eyes burning with clarity. A few team members clapped. Others looked down. Everyone felt the same thing. They had failed him again, and he had turned their failure into fire. He didn't win. He didn't need to. Because what he proved in those 44 laps wasn't just that he still has it. He proved that he never lost it. And the world of Formula One? It now waits with bated breath. Because Lewis Hamilton has stopped asking for respect. Now he's taking it back, one overtake at a time. Forget what the lap charts said. Forget what the broadcaster speculated and what the team radio allowed you to hear. What happened to Lewis Hamilton in Belgium was never about bad luck or timing. It was the direct result of an internal failure so profound, so deeply rooted in Ferrari's current identity crisis, that it went far beyond one ruined weekend. What unfolded at Spa-Francorchamps wasn't a racing mistake, it was a betrayal disguised as innovation. Behind the red-painted garage doors and beneath the high-tech engineering dashboards, Ferrari made a decision they wouldn't dare admit in public. Hamilton's car had been outfitted with a newly developed component, a drastic alteration to the underfloor and rear suspension interaction architecture. According to internal sources, it was an unrefined system, hastily modeled, poorly verified, and still in the experimental stage. It wasn't a finished product. It was a prototype. A concept that had shown promise in theoretical simulations, but hadn't undergone rigorous, real-world trials. And yet, they installed it on Hamilton's chassis for one of the most demanding, unpredictable tracks on the entire calendar. The rationale behind this move was rooted in desperation. Ferrari had grown increasingly obsessed with outsmarting their rivals not through conventional evolution, but through revolutionary concepts, even if it meant gambling their most valuable asset. Engineers hoped the revised linkage would offer improved aerodynamic sealing at high speeds, better rear-end stability under load, and smoother transitions in lateral weight transfer. But what they failed to grasp, or worse, chose to ignore, was the risk of disrupting the car's entire behavioral baseline. Lewis sensed the consequences immediately. From the opening minutes of Free Practice 1, it was obvious. The car no longer responded with predictability. Turn-in had become an act of faith. Mid-corner rotation was inconsistent. Rear traction, especially in the slower chicanes, was vanishing beneath him. He felt every inconsistency in his spine, in his fingertips, in the way the steering wheel pushed back, or didn't. There were moments where the car gripped flawlessly, only to completely lose coherence 2 corners later. He conveyed all of this repeatedly, with clarity and urgency. He explained the erratic behavior. He described how the chassis now felt disconnected from the road, as if floating instead of anchoring itself into the asphalt. He flagged that braking zones were compromised because the platform was oscillating, creating an unstable aerodynamic surface that distorted the car's response to input. The team listened, but they didn't truly hear him. Instead of immediate course correction, they reassured him that the data still showed promise. That corner entry delta times were within margins. That tire temperature distribution was still in range. That the system just needed more track time to settle. Not once did they entertain the possibility that the component was fundamentally flawed. They were more committed to protecting their model than protecting their driver. By the time free practice 3 came around, the car had become borderline undrivable. Hamilton's telemetry showed a constant war against the rear axle. He was making an extraordinary number of steering corrections just to keep the car pointed straight. Down the Kemmel Straight, the speed was there, but every time he tried to load the car through the long arcs of Pohon or the aggressive drops of Eau Rouge, it felt like balancing on a knife's edge. Even minor throttle adjustments would provoke snap oversteer. The SF-25 wasn't just out of sync, it was out of control. In qualifying, all of that instability came to a head. On a drying track, with temperatures fluctuating and grip levels changing minute by minute, precision was everything. But Hamilton had none of it. His first push lap was ruined by rear instability. His second was compromised by lockups. And his final attempt? A desperate lap, full of corrections, moments, heart-stopping saves, all to wrestle a car that simply wouldn't obey. When the session ended, the result was as brutal as it was inevitable. Eliminated. In Q1. In a Ferrari. To the outside world, it was shocking. To those inside Hamilton's camp, it was sickening, but expected. As the media descended with questions, the team issued soft statements about strategy misalignment, tricky track conditions, and unexpected variables. But the real truth remained sealed behind the team's rigid silence. Inside the post-qualifying debrief, the tension was unbearable. Engineers avoided his gaze. Some sat frozen in front of their laptops, others scrolled through meaningless overlays and graphs. Hamilton, composed but boiling beneath the surface, delivered his assessment with chilling precision. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. This car wasn't ready. You knew it. I told you. And you left me out there anyway. No one refuted him. Because no one could. The experimental system had failed catastrophically, not just technically, but politically, philosophically, and personally. Ferrari had dismissed the feedback of a 7-time world champion. They had gambled with his race weekend, his credibility, and their own integrity. And they had lost on every front. This wasn't just about a botched component. It was about a culture that had shifted dangerously away from driver-led development. A team that once built its greatness on passion, on instinct, on human brilliance, now shackled to algorithms, simulations, and theoretical models that couldn't account for what a driver actually felt in the cockpit. The soul of Ferrari, the racing soul, was vanishing. And Hamilton, for all his professionalism, could feel it slipping through his hands. He hadn't come to Maranello to be a guinea pig. He hadn't crossed enemy lines to become a pawn in a misguided engineering revolution. He came to chase legacy. To create something unforgettable. To win. And what he had received, instead, was a team that believed its spreadsheets more than it believed him. When he walked out of that garage at Spa, the points didn't matter. The headlines didn't matter. What mattered was the realization that he wasn't just fighting against the competition. He was fighting for control inside the walls of his own team. What happened next wasn't merely a consequence of regulations. It was a visceral blow, a public display of disregard that cut deeper than any podium snub or bad pit call. After a weekend already drenched in frustration, miscommunication, and mechanical instability, came the coup de grace. Lewis Hamilton would not even be permitted to start the race alongside his rivals. He would begin from the pit lane. Not from the back row. Not just behind his teammate. From the fringes. From the shadows. From a position that felt less like a grid slot and more like exile. He had been removed from the chessboard and placed outside the game entirely. And the irony was suffocating. Because the decision stemmed from a flurry of late-night changes Ferrari had rushed to implement, emergency repairs to undo the setup disaster that had made Hamilton's car all but undrivable in qualifying. These weren't tweaks. These were survival measures. A complete reset of the mechanical balance. But in doing so, they breached park firm protocol. The punishment? Start in silence. Watch the field race away. Begin your war alone. To the outside world, it looked like a death sentence. The commentators braced for a lonely afternoon. The pundits called it a write-off. Social media declared his race meaningless. What more could he do from that far back, in that kind of car, under those conditions? But Hamilton's silence told a different story. Because in the darkest moments, When he's isolated, overlooked, counted out, something awakens in him. Something terrifying. Not rage. Not panic. Something more dangerous. Purpose. While others rested, Ferrari's engineers worked through the night with surgical precision. They weren't trying to build a fast car. They were just trying to give Hamilton something predictable. Something consistent. The rear end, previously snapping without warning, was tamed with revised damping. Aero balance was shifted forward to sharpen the turn-in without destabilizing exits. Toe settings were recalibrated for better stability under braking. Suspension travel was increased. Ride height raised just enough to stop the bottoming through fast corners. Brake bias was adjusted. Torque maps were softened. It wasn't a rebirth, but it was enough to return control to the man behind the wheel. And when he emerged from the pit lane, with the race already underway and the thunder of the main pack vanishing into the first sector, he didn't hesitate. He didn't look back. He flicked the visor down, turned in, and began what would soon be remembered not as a recovery, but as a reckoning. His first few laps were pure calculation, not rushing, not lunging, but gathering data. Mapping grip. Testing traction. Calibrating tire wear. Reading traffic. Then, with the foundation set, he attacked. Not recklessly. Not like a man desperate for headlines. But like a tactician. Every move was timed to perfection. Every overtake executed with surgical clarity. He swept past Logan Sargent with a kind of precision you only see from someone who's processed 5 variables in a split second. Tire delta, exit speed, wind direction, ERS reserve, and opponent behavior. Then came Kevin Magnussen, a perfectly judged dive into turn 6 that looked aggressive but was, in truth, orchestrated 5 corners earlier. Esteban Ocon was next, caught off guard by Hamilton's positioning through high-speed direction changes. Zhou was baited into defending the inside, only to watch helplessly as Hamilton floated around the outside with impossible confidence. But it wasn't just the speed. It was the authority. He didn't overtake, he commanded position. Telemetry analysts in the Ferrari garage were stunned. His cornering speeds weren't just competitive, they were exceeding simulations. His throttle traces showed maximum traction extraction without instability. Brake wear stayed low. Tire degradation was minimal. He was driving with absolute mechanical sympathy while pulling off overtakes that belonged in highlight reels. By lap 10, he had passed more cars than most drivers manage in an entire race. But it was how he passed them that sent a shiver through the paddock. Not one desperate lunge. No wheels banging. No risky half moves. Just a man so in sync with his machinery, so laser-focused, that it felt less like racing and more like a masterclass in motion. And the silence on the Ferrari radio was telling. There was no panic. No yelling. Just quiet acknowledgement of something extraordinary taking shape. Pace is strong, his engineer finally said. Translation? We didn't see this coming either. Further up the road, teams began checking their data. Hamilton is how far back? He's already cleared the second DRS train. His deltas are green. Rival strategists scrambled. Recalculations began. Suddenly, a man who wasn't supposed to be in the picture was changing the entire race complexion. He caught Lance Stroll and dismantled him with a triple corner setup that forced the Canadian into defensive lines 2 laps in a row, then opened the door cleanly with a timed switchback through the chicane. Alex Albon tried to resist, but Hamilton read his defensive mode like an open book, waited for the inevitable tire fade, and launched a perfectly calculated move into turn 1. 2 wheels on the grass, heart in his throat, but never one stepping beyond control. At that point, something shifted. The crowd felt it. The pit wall felt it. The other drivers really felt it. Hamilton was no longer climbing. He was ascending. And by lap 20, there was no more debate. The pit lane start was old news. What mattered now was that Hamilton, in a car that had tried to kill him 24 hours earlier, was marching through the field with clinical ferocity. Not with luck. Not through chaos. But by sheer force of will. When he entered the points, the energy shifted completely. Commentators began replaying his overtakes with disbelief. Mechanics from other teams leaned toward monitors. Camera directors switched to his onboard. Ferrari, suddenly alert, started discussing alternative pit strategies. Because now, anything was possible. And Hamilton? He didn't flinch. He didn't celebrate. He didn't even react. Because this, all of this, had always been the plan. Not to survive. To remind. Remind the world that his greatness was never manufactured. That it wasn't tied to dominant cars or team favoritism. That when stripped of advantage, given nothing but a wheel and a will, he could still dismantle the grid. Piece by piece. Corner by corner. Lap by relentless lap. And when he finally crossed the line, higher than anyone thought possible, further than any prediction model dared suggest, he said nothing. He didn't need to. The entire race had become his answer. And the silence of everyone who had doubted him? That was the loudest part of all. Something inexplicable was unfolding in plain sight, yet few dared to name it out loud. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't even particularly visible, and yet it was unmistakably felt. It clung to the airwaves. It pressed down on the pit wall. It haunted the cockpit displays. Something was wrong. Or rather, something was different. The Ferrari radio, usually a non-stop cascade of voices, calculations, urgent warnings, frantic adjustments, redundant commands, had gone still. Ghostly still. As if the frequency had been abandoned. As if someone had pressed mute on the most controlling team on the grid. It wasn't technical failure. It wasn't accidental silence. It was something far more jarring, deliberate absence. No calls to change engine modes. No panicked updates about tire wear. No suggestions. No corrections. No interference. Ferrari, the team known for orchestrating every millisecond of a race with the subtlety of a marching band, had suddenly relinquished control. And the reason wasn't hard to understand. They were no longer driving Lewis Hamilton's race. They were observing it. Because what was happening out on the circuit wasn't just racing. It was reclamation. Redemption. Something holy. Something sacred. And no one on the Ferrari pit wall dared to interrupt it. By the time the race reached its 20th lap, Hamilton had transformed what looked like a hopeless weekend into an elegant resurrection. A car that had been undrivable the day before, that had let him down in qualifying, that had left him stranded far from the front, he was now using it like an extension of his soul. Not with rage. Not with noise. But with composure sharpened into a weapon. Others were unraveling. Carlos Sainz, under pressure and clearly overreaching, attempted a desperate move to defend position that earned him a time penalty. His judgment, once confident, now looked shaky. Lance Stroll, whose early race promise had quickly disintegrated, made a string of defensive missteps that turned progress into regression. Yuki Tsunoda, always fiery, couldn't control the emotional throttle and collided recklessly under pressure. But Lewis? He rose above the chaos. Not with raw aggression, but with surgical efficiency. Every move was a masterstroke. He didn't dive bomb. He didn't gamble. He observed. Calculated. Executed. Passed. With dignity. With certainty. With a kind of elegance that made the race feel like it was slowing down for him, as if time itself were bending around his intent. He didn't just fight his way through the field. He redefined what the car beneath him was capable of. He made a compromised machine look like it belonged on the podium. Not because it suddenly worked better, but because he worked around its flaws so seamlessly that the flaws disappeared. And then came the checkered flag. P7. On paper, a middle-class finish. In context, an act of defiance. A message etched not in carbon fiber, but in legacy. A warning disguised as a result. A declaration that he was still very much here, still elite, still dangerous, still rewriting what greatness looks like. And what did Ferrari say? Almost nothing. No exuberant cheers. No cathartic screams. No breathless praise. Just a sterile voice over the radio, casually delivering sector comparisons. No thanks. No excitement. No soul. Just a quiet, analytical whisper. The kind of message you send when you don't know what else to say, when you're not sure if you're supposed to celebrate or apologize. Because deep down, they knew, they hadn't authored this moment. They hadn't lifted him up. They had simply watched as a driver took their mistakes, their mediocrity, their misdirection, and buried it beneath a performance so commanding it left them speechless. Then came the post-race cameras. The predictable questions. The media frenzy. Hamilton, ever the professional, stood tall and delivered his lines with grace. He thanked the team, acknowledged the overnight repairs, praised the effort, smiled politely. And yet, beneath every calm syllable, there was a current of something much louder. A truth that didn't need to be said aloud because it had already been shouted, lap after lap, on the racetrack. You didn't win this for me. I won this despite you. But he didn't say it. He didn't need to. Everyone in that paddock, from the mechanics cleaning the tires to the executives in glass offices, had felt the same chill, that they were witnessing a man operating above the noise, above the drama, above the dysfunction. He hadn't driven the car Ferrari gave him. He had elevated it. He hadn't participated in a race. He had imposed his will on it. And in doing so, he didn't just climb from the back of the grid, he pulled Ferrari out of a moral slump. He gave them something they hadn't earned but desperately needed: hope. Not with PR. Not with luck. Not with politics. With silence. With consistency. With class. He had spoken. Not through interviews. Not through memes. Not through complaints. He had spoken through driving. Through impossible overtakes. Through tire management. Through pace, poise, patience. And now everyone, fans, rivals, critics, even the men on the Ferrari pit wall, had heard him. Not through volume, but through velocity. Not through blame, but through brilliance. Let me know if you want this to continue with behind-the-scenes reactions from Verstappen, Toto Wolff, or the Italian media explosion. This wasn't about applause, attention, or affirmations from the sidelines. This wasn't about external validation or reclaiming popularity. What happened that weekend wasn't a public performance, it was a personal reckoning. Lewis Hamilton wasn't trying to prove his worth to the world. He was sending a message straight to the heart of Ferrari. A message forged in focus, carved through corners, and amplified with every calculated move on track. This wasn't an outburst, it was a carefully delivered statement, one that echoed louder than any press conference or post-race quote ever could. It wasn't about asking what if. It was about demanding why not sooner. Why hadn't they listened? Why hadn't they placed faith in the most experienced driver on the grid when he'd given them every reason to? How many race weekends were sacrificed on the altar of over-engineering and stubbornness? How many championship points slipped away because the instinct of a world-class driver was buried beneath technical models and strategic rigidity? Inside Ferrari's command center, the gears began turning in ways they hadn't in years. The aftermath of Spa wasn't just a performance review, it was a cultural shockwave. Long-held assumptions were crumbling. Senior figures, once steadfast in their belief that their systems knew better than their driver, suddenly found themselves revisiting old telemetry, listening to past radio communications with renewed intensity, hunting for the buried moments where Hamilton's voice had been drowned out. He wasn't asking for miracles. He was asking to be heard. And now, belatedly, the realization is sinking in. His Spa drive wasn't fueled by desperation. It was driven by clarity, the clarity of a man who knew he still had everything it takes, and simply needed an opening to prove it. He didn't just outperform expectations, he dismantled them. Across the paddock, rival teams looked on with a new sense of urgency. Team principals who had quietly written him off as a fading contender began reassessing their threat calculations. Engineers whispered about sector data that defied the limits of the car's design. Analysts who had spent a year calling his Ferrari project a misstep suddenly shifted their tone, forced to admit what Spa had made impossible to deny: Hamilton wasn't in decline, he had simply been restrained. And outside the garages, in the living rooms and phones of fans across the globe, the reaction was volcanic. Social platforms lit up with pure energy. Clips of his overtakes went viral in minutes. Memes were replaced by admiration. Former doubters turned into born-again believers. The driver of the day vote became a landslide. Comment sections were flooded with 4 simple words: "He's still got it." But this wasn't about nostalgia. This wasn't a final flicker of brilliance. This was a controlled blaze, a deliberate ignition of something far more dangerous. Hamilton didn't just remind the world of his talent, he reminded Ferrari of their obligation. Their obligation to trust him, to utilize him, to stop treating him like a ceremonial figurehead and start treating him like what he's always been: a race weapon. Inside the Scuderia, the atmosphere shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably. Strategy briefings grew more attentive. Engineering sessions lingered longer. Technical directors, once dismissive, now leaned in when Hamilton spoke. The hierarchy didn't collapse, but it began to bend. And in that quiet transformation, a truth began to crystallize. If they just let him lead, everything could change. Spa didn't bring closure. It cracked something open. Because it wasn't just about salvaging points or outshining expectations. It was about shattering a myth. The myth that he was past his prime. The myth that the car was beyond saving. The myth that instinct and experience are somehow obsolete in an age ruled by data. Hamilton took those myths and tore them apart, not with speeches, but with pure execution. He didn't need drama. He needed control. And now, with every lap that follows, Ferrari faces a decision they can no longer delay. Will they recalibrate around the greatest driver of his generation, or will they continue to dilute his influence with indecision and internal politics? Because one thing is clear, Spa was not a fluke. It was a preview. A taste of what could become a tidal wave if they truly unlock the full potential of their driver and his machine. The championship may still be mathematically open, but something much larger is unfolding. Momentum. Energy. Belief. Hamilton has shifted the tone of the entire narrative, and now, even his fiercest rivals are watching more closely. They've seen what he can do when he's ignored. The question now is, what happens when he's supported? And for those watching from the pit wall, from the stands, from millions of screens across the planet, one thing is undeniable. If Spa was just a warning shot, the rest of the season might be war.